on the nose at 6:30. We're going to go ahead and get started. And my name is Rachel Hatton, and on behalf of all of us at the David C. Anchin Center for the Advancement of Teaching, we want to welcome you to tonight's Anchin Community Talks event. Tonight, our featured panelists will be discussing race, racism, and speech in the K-12 classroom. As you know, 6 states have banned critical race theory from their classrooms, and 16 more are considering a ban during their state's next legislative session. Here in Florida, critical race theory was deemed by the State Board of Education as inconsistent with state board approved standards. Our goal for tonight's event is to hear from our distinguished panelists their own perspectives on this evolving and important topic, and share some information with practicing teachers and administrators as we all prepare to head back to school this fall. If you are on social media and want to share takeaways from tonight's webinar, please use the hashtag #ActForJustice. And if you'd like to submit a question to the panel, please visit www.tinyurl.com/AnchinQuestion. You can also type a question in the chat box, and a few of us from the Anchin Center will do our best to monitor those questions and submit them to the moderator. Our moderator for tonight's event is Dr. Dana Thompson-Dorsey. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to her. Dr. Thompson-Dorsey holds the Endowed Chair in Education Innovation in the David C. Anchin Center, and she's a faculty member in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies Department here at the University of South Florida. Dr. Thompson-Dorsey will provide some additional context for tonight's panel discussion and will introduce our featured panelists. I want to thank all the panelists for being here tonight, and I'll pass it off to Dana from here. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thank you, Rachel. Really appreciate the introduction and welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out this evening to have this very important and pertinent discussion regarding race, racism, and K-12 and speech in K-12 classrooms. I am joined by an esteemed panel of scholars, educators, colleagues who are going to share a lot of information with us that will be helpful, particularly for educators going back into the public schools in just a few weeks. So I'd like to begin by having our panelists introduce themselves. So I am going to go in the order of my screen, and at the top of my screen right now is Dr. Steve Pramooze. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are and your background?
Yes, I want to make sure I'm not being muted.
We can hear you.
Most of my students would rather not hear me. So I think the fact that there's an open mic is much appreciated. I want to express my appreciation to Dana and the other members of this panel who are assuredly esteemed with my exception, and joining in this very critical and focused concern about teaching in the classroom, K-12. I'd like to share that I bring 2 or 3 things to the table. First of all, I have been an administrator and a teacher in inner city schools in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Have also had the wonderful opportunity of going to the University of Minnesota for my education. And post-education, I've had the wonderful opportunity of teaching at 3 universities and also serving as Dean of Education at 3 universities, including the University of South Florida. I would also like to share that my experiences in working on the issues of race, racism, and teaching in K-12 is really enhanced by the fact that I've been able to teach, study, and teach school law for the last 25 to 30 years. And as a result, I like to see myself as what I would call the bridger, a person who looks at the abstract of law and how it's written into translating it for what teachers and principals should learn when they enter the classroom and teach, which I think is something of critical nature to us all. And finally, it's been a pleasure to work with especially the National Urban League as part of my background, where I was chairman of the board at Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is Louisville, and then ended up being on the executive committee of the National Urban League Council of Board Chairs. which gave me interesting insights. And again, specifics to come if you'd care to answer about controversy at that table. And there was plenty of it. Thanks very much, Dana.
Thank you, Dr. Pramooze. And he also should tell you that he's a comedian. So I'm sure you're going to hear some comic relief during this time. And I think we may need some of it. So thank you, Dr. Pramooze. Next on my screen is Miss April Cobb. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good evening, everyone. I am April Cobb, and I am a middle school teacher here in Hillsborough County. I've been teaching public school for a little over 21 years. About me, I'm a 6th grade teacher. I've always taught in Title I schools, and that basically serves socioeconomically challenged communities and children that come from those communities. And I have a very strong interest in the school to prison pipeline, which also leads into a lot of the conversation around critical race theory. But I'll leave that conversation leading into when we get more into the discussion. And I look forward to hearing all the insight that the panelists will bring along with myself. Thank you for having me.
I think you still need, I think you need to unmute. Steve,
Oh.
Dr. Tauber, do you need to unmute yourself? Okay.
Yes, sorry about
There
that.
you go. No, it's
Okay.
okay.
So thank you, everyone. So my name is Stephen Tauber, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of South Florida. So I think I might be the only person on the panel without a K-12 background, except for my own K-12 experience, which I like most educators, greatly value, especially upon reflection. I have been teaching at USF since 1995, so I'm going into my 27th year. And my classes focus on American politics, and my research focuses on social justice. Primarily, although not necessarily relevant to this panel, I focus on the politics of animal rights. But I also focus a lot on the politics of race and ethnicity. And I'm going to take a quick opportunity to plug this book, American Government in Black and White, which is an introduction to American government textbook. And like all textbooks, it covers all the various aspects of American government and politics. This one is unique because my co-author and I focus each element of American politics through the lens of race and ethnicity. And we tell the story of American government as part of the story of race and ethnicity, both the challenges and some of the progress. And I am very grateful to be invited to the panel, and I would like to thank Dana, and I would also like to thank Rachel for their help, and I'm grateful to be with the other esteemed panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tauber. We really appreciate your presence here and look forward to what you'll have to share with us. We're all going to learn from you. So next I see on my list here, Dr. Brenda Walker. Would you mind talking and introducing yourself, please?
It certainly is my pleasure, and thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Brenda L. Walker, and I'm a professor at the University of South Florida, and I'm currently in the Teaching and Learning Department, and I've been in the College of Education for the past 30 years, College of Education at the University of South Florida. So the conversations that we're going to have this evening are not novel for me at all. In fact, my entire career, I've pretty much been committed to having these kinds of conversations. And most of my work, all of my work in large measure, focuses on improving outcomes for African-American learners in particular. And that it's operationalized by my work in the area of the school to prison pipeline, in the area of special education disproportionality, as well as the suspension rate, as we all know, that impacts African-American learners more than any other racial group. And my work is premised and I'm very proud to say my work is premised on critical race theory. So I welcome the conversations that we're going to have this evening. I'm also an attorney, um, focusing on school law, education law, as well as poverty and civil rights laws. I teach special education law, and Steve, I've not taught it as long as you've taught school law, but upon completing law school, one of the first tasks that I undertook was to develop a special education law course at the University of South Florida. And prior to that, I developed for doctoral students an urban special education course. So again, thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking so forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And last but certainly not least on our panel, we have Dr. Sharon Jefferson.
Good evening, and thank you, Dana and Rachel, for this opportunity to engage in this very important discussion tonight. So, I am Sharon Jefferson. I have been an educator for 26 years. In addition to teaching, I am also involved in community work. I started a nonprofit organization called Recess Education that collaborates with community stakeholders who are committed to ending disparities in education through research-based, innovative, and culturally relevant educational programs in order to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, as well as close the achievement gap that adversely impacts students of color in their community. So I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk about these very important topics in education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jefferson. So as we get started, I'm going to have several questions I'm going to ask the panelists to ask generally, and then some specifically for particular panelists. But first, I want to frame our discussion, as we are going to focus quite a bit on critical race theory and what this means for this topic we're addressing around race, racism, and teacher speech. So this is a map of the states within the United States and different actions that have been taken over just the past 3 or 4 months with regards to critical race theory, or just addressing issues of race or racism, sexism, or any divisive topics in the classroom. As Rachel mentioned at the very beginning, there has been 6 states so far that have passed laws where basically you would like to say critical race theory has been banned, but the legislation does not use that specific language. The language that is used is similar to the executive order that Donald Trump passed last year in September of 2020. So there's language about diversity training. There's language dealing with what teachers can or cannot do or cannot be forced to do in their classroom, such as teach about individuals who saying that individuals of one race are better than individuals of another race, or individuals of one sex is better than an individual of another sex. And of course, there's language in all of these, this legislation as well, that talks about students should not be made to feel bad about themselves because of their race or because of their ancestors or things their ancestors may have done. And that's why certain theories like critical race theory cannot be taught in K-12 schools. So the 6 states that have completely banned these types of discussions are Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Texas, and Oklahoma. Florida, as well as Georgia, Utah, Montana, actually have not passed legislation because there were some types of laws already in place dealing with instruction. So they actually created education policies that come out of their state board of education that interpret certain laws or policies that were already in place. So in Florida, section 1003.42 actually discusses the type of instruction that is to occur in Florida's K-12 public schools. And the policy that was passed in June speaks to the interpretation of this law, which was actually passed around 1994, and also includes the laws dealing with the teaching of the Holocaust and African-American history. But we will talk about that in a minute. But there are other states who have tried to introduce legislation that has stalled or didn't pass. But as you can see from, if hopefully you all can see on your screen, those states that are gray have not taken any action as of yet. No state level action. So this is where we are right now. And I will say Florida is the only state that specifically in their policy names critical race theory specifically in banning it. So I'd like to ask our panel, what is your understanding of critical race theory and what does it have to do with education? And any of you can feel free to answer.
Well, as far as education, my understanding of critical race theory is that it is a theoretical framework that investigates how race influence education inequities.
It also, it's like any of the other critical theory schools, it's, that stemmed from the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, a postmodern critique of technology and modernism, and a post-Marxist critique that you could see in gender and sexuality and architecture and international relations, critical animal studies. It's an advanced graduate law school level type of theoretical framework, as Dr. Jefferson indicated, and it's very nuanced. It is, as all critical theories, controversial, but what's happened is that starting with primarily the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank, is they're limiting or starting to put together diversity and other kinds of non-critical race theory into critical race theory and trying to make it seem controversial. And I apologize for our 11-month-old puppy wants attention. But part of what's been going on is that opponents of diversity training, opponents of inclusion, are now lumping inclusion and diversity or teaching facts about American history in with critical race theory, which is controversial, and it's a purposeful tactic to try to undermine a lot of civil rights progress that's happened.
The other comment I'd add, the concept of critical race theory has been here for a long time. It is posited at the graduate levels, and it really refers to a study of the issues under law in which race is dealt with. So if you're looking at laws of the state, federal government, it is a system of looking at those laws. The word critical is adopted by a lot of people who I think are afraid of the study. It's not so much the study is different or unimportant, but I must say that I see this as a, if you will, a combination of integration of what our title is for this program. This is yet another example, in my view, of systematic and systemic racism. That's what it is. Call it whatever you want, but you can't whitewash it. That is what it is. And it's simply a commentary of historic racism that continues and continues. And we look at it as a forest, but in reality, it's a tree of the forest. It's one of the many elements in our society, historically and presently, that try and define race as a differential of people rather than a commonality of people. And that's objective. My concern also is something called censorship. To what degree do I, as a professor, and all the other colleagues here who work with teachers, tell them not to be honest about what we believe is true? And I think that's a tragic underpinning of this and other concerns historically over the role, and I won't go into it in depth now, but of the difference between states and the federal government and looking at law. And since I come from that perspective, more to share later on, my commentary to you is there is nothing upsetting about critical race theory. If you say it is historically looked at as an analysis of law, as Dr. Tauber has introduced, it's a look at law that involves systemic and systematic racism over time. That's it. It's innocent. It could be or could not be, but you study that particularly as the new tree in the forest of racism. That's my perspective at this point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Pramooze.
Yes, and if I could add that what's deeply disturbing about the whole critical race theory debate is the way critical race theory is being painted as the boogeyman, and everything is lumped in. It's looked at as emanating from the Black Lives Matter movement, from LGBTQ, and everything. And so I think the conversation really has to start with clarifying what it is and what it is not. And it's so mixed up in there in the debate in Florida, I'll speak specifically, is that, it's so conflated, and we need to really separate out. And, we have legislators saying that critical race theory is being taught K through 12. I'm in and out of schools all the time. I've never been in a classroom where a teacher was teaching critical race theory. Now, you come in my classroom, it's a different story at the university. I'm espousing critical race theory because it is a framework that helps us to uncover systemic racism. I mean, how will we ever do something about the disproportionate discipline of African-American learners if we don't take on a critical race theory framework to uncover why it's happening and what we can do about it? One of my favorite tenets of critical race theory is that it honors counter narratives.
That's right.
Often we go one place to get answers. How often do we go to the students who've been suspended to get answers and get recommendations from them on ways that their teachers and school leaders, can educate them more equitably? So I think the conversation has to start there. What is critical race theory and what is it not?
Very important. Very important. Rachel, can you pull up the slide that actually talks about critical race theory specifically? I believe it's slide 7. Yes, there we go. So if we were, just as all the panelists have explained, if we were to think about critical race theory in the most basic way, it is a research method, it's an analytical tool, a way to look at society, a way to look at even the world, not just the United States, but you can look at the world through this lens as well. But in talking specifically about the United States, critical race theory consciously foregrounds racism and power in our society. And it's to expose and help to eradicate white dominance and ideologies that are deeply embedded in the foundation of our institutions and structures. So that would be, for example, talking about education, or even talking about our banking system, our criminal justice system, our housing system, our housing laws and policies. Those types of institutions and structures that have been in place for hundreds of years critical race theory discusses, and you talk about theory because of the analytical tool, but would you say that, and Brenda, I think I would direct this toward you, because we both are lawyers. And so when I think about theory, as many people think theory, that this is something that people are espousing that may or may not be true. But given that critical race theory began with legal scholars, Rachel, can you pull up that slide as well with the history? Yes. So it began with legal scholars, and at legal scholars who are also, before they were legal professors, practiced law. You don't go into a courtroom, you don't make an argument unless you have evidence, unless you have, in this case, if we're talking about the structures and foundations in the United States of America, and we're talking about this long history, we know that there's documentation, whether we're looking at legal cases, legislation, even the very old legal cases and legislation, but also, for example, think about legislative intent. So those documents that have been written as notes as legislators were talking about passing specific laws that may allow slavery to move forward in the 1700s, or Dred Scott talking about that. So Brenda, how much theory versus fact is in critical race theory?
Okay, ask that question again, Dr. Thompson.
So how much theory versus fact is really a part of critical race theory? Because theory is often seen as something that is something that needs to be proven. But given that this was started by legal scholars,
I see.
how much of it is grounded in fact? Because it's evidence, it's based in legal cases, legislation, old notes, and I don't know if they're necessarily recordings, but old notes that were written as hundreds of years ago as founding fathers of the United States and legislators were talking and meeting about certain restrictions, laws, constitutional amendments. How much fact versus theory is critical race theory?
I think that's an interesting question. And so one of the number, I don't know, Dana, when you were in law school, but the number one answer when I was in law school was, it depends.
It depends. Yes.
It depends.
Of course.
And I think that's so relevant here, because I think it depends on how it's used, how critical race theory is used as, like I say, as a framework. And I'll give you an example. So one of the research studies that you and I both are on around out of school suspensions. So what we did was we applied critical race theory to undergird the research process. And for instance, so we are going to the community. We have gone to the community and students to find out their perspectives of suspension, the students who are getting suspended and their parents and their community members. So in effect, what we're doing is taking that critical race lens, looking through that lens, and then we're coming up with our own evidence, our own facts by getting these counter narratives. So I think, again, it just depends on how it's used, but that's the way we're undergirding our research, which is pretty much the same way that I undergird my community engagement. I don't go to the community and and take it upon myself to think I know what the community needs. I know all the answers. I use a critical race theory framework where I'm honoring the community. And I'm going very much as a student of the community. So again, it just depends on how you take that framework and how you apply it.
Yes, very true. Very true.
Could I ask you to go back? Could I ask you to go back to the definition, please? This frightens people. Look at the definition.
Right.
Consciously foregrounds race, racism, and power in American society to expose and eradicate white dominance and ideologies deeply embedded in the foundations of American institutions and structures. Sometimes it's not the idea, but how the idea is pronounced. So in discussions with leaders, K-12 schools, leaders in higher education, the threat comes from to expose and eradicate white dominance and ideologies deeply embedded in the foundations of American institutions and structures.
Yeah.
If you took out that phrase, everybody would say, well, that's what we're doing anyway. But the assumptions built in here scare people who get scared of an assumptions. And that's a framework to educate people.
Right.
Do you have a minute or two to let me quote the governor on why his law was passed? Is that,
Yes.
do you have some time?
Yes, please.
Governor DeSantis, through his news release for his staff says, today, Governor DeSantis joined the State Board of Education meeting to discuss the importance of maintaining the integrity of Florida's academic standards by keeping critical race theory out of the classroom. Here's the quotation, the woke class. And again, if you haven't looked up the word WOKE, please do.
Yes.
The woke class wants to teach kids to hate each other rather than teaching them how to read. But we will not them bring nonsense ideology into Florida schools, said Governor Ron DeSantis. As the governor of Florida, as the quotation continues, I love this state and I love my country. I find it unthinkable that there are other people in positions of leadership in the federal government who believe that we should teach kids to hate our country. We will not stand for it here in Florida. I'm proud that we are taking action today to ensure our state continues to have the greatest educational system in the nation. Less the challenge more than one or two spots in that, governor is saying on behalf of the state of Florida, when you tell me you're going to work to expose and eradicate white dominance and ideologies, I'm saying, oh, that's not what we want. So there is a middle ground of saying, what really is this all about? And is the historical antecedent part of the consequence we're looking at today? Or are we asking for an objective look at history that's not tainted by historians who may have a prejudice one way or the other? You change it that way, it's a different model.
Right.
But people who want to denigrate anything, take a look at the definition, find the words they don't like and say, well, that's the problem.
Right.
So there has got to be a model. If the ideology of critical race theory is important to us, it may or may not be that way, but there has to be some kind of an understanding that we're looking at evidence. We are not looking for hysteria.
Exactly.
We're looking for data.
Yes.
We are looking for,
you got that right. Yes.
You know, it's not as if James Meredith didn't run into something like this. This is part of the history of Americana and how it works and why it works. And again, you know, one of the great experts and colleagues we have on this panel, Steve, can talk very directly because of his book and his analysis. There is a fear of what people don't know. Does that surprise anybody? Shall we talk about vaccinations? Shall we talk about, do you understand? There is this overall concern.
I understand. And,
Thank
you know, yes. And thank you, Steve, because I would agree that this definition, which, like I said, it's just a basic definition used for a researcher, right, as an analytical tool. But there's so much more in that is part of this definition. And, you know, I teach critical race theory. I've taught it for years, and there's a lot to learn about what this means. But one thing that is clear is that it's not taught in K-12 classrooms and never has been. And that's important. Even if there are teachers and building and district leaders who may believe in some of the tenets and some of the principles, and that may come through in how they teach, you know, without them even specifically saying race or racism, or even materials they may select for students to read. That does not, it is not taught and has never been taught. Okay, it's not even commonplace in graduate schools and law schools today. I taught this course for the first time at UNC Chapel Hill in 2013, and I created the course in the School of Education there.
And I want to
Okay.
add to that too, Dr. Dorsey, is that in the middle school setting, and I also taught high school when I first started in the district, is that I never even heard the term before until it became a political buzzword. And so many times us as educators, you know, in K through 12, we get caught up in the limbo and the conversations that are happening about what we should and should not be doing. But no one is speaking to what the children are asking in the classroom.
That's right.
If we take the opportunity to be more intentional about listening to what the children would like to learn about or what their questions spark, then this whole conversation or this buzzword, you know, political buzzword for right now, critical race theory, the children ask what they want to know. They literally ask. So even in the history classes or whatever it is that they may be learning for a specific topic, or, you know, they will lead the conversations, and realistically, that's what's supposed to be happening in classrooms.
Right.
Teachers are supposed to be facilitators. They're not supposed to, you know, literally dictate everything that's going on in the classrooms. And if we start limiting our children from having the opportunity to share out what it is that they want to direct the conversation with, then why are they even in school?
That's right. So I want to ask Dr. Tauber, can you explain to us the U.S. government's history, political history, with passing legislation and policies that restrict people's rights based on race or ethnicity or gender?
Sure. Real quick, you know, one good analogy I bring to my class when we had a discussion about this, I'm currently teaching in Summer B, is banning critical race theory from K to 12 would be like banning string theory in K through 12 physics. Because it's beyond, intellectually beyond the scope of the K through 12. You know, on that question, one of the things that I think it's important to understand when especially teaching the founding is that there are ideals that this nation's found on: classical liberalism, which is about individual freedom, classical republicanism, and civic virtue. And those ideas are important and they're relevant, but there's also another undercurrent of our founding, which is the tradition of exclusion, which included slavery, you know, which the concept of race, which there's no question race is socially constructed. There are biological elements to it, but the categories are socially constructed. It's constructed to justify how we can enslave people while claiming that we're, you know, Lockean liberals and Rousseauian Republicans, yet we're enslaving people. They use the category, and it's part of the Anglo, you know, the European colonization, is they use this idea that these people are inferior, so we can enslave them. Or in the case of the indigenous population, it basically exterminate them to take their land. And then the old common law tradition of coverture, which is that basically women are the property of their husbands. Those were part of our founding, and I think to not teach them is to do a disservice to students. And those can be taught at the K through 12 level. Not, you know, they don't have to read John Locke, or they don't have to read, you know, the Iroquois Constitution, but they can be told these basic realities, and to not teach that will set us back to what education was like probably, you know, 40, 50 years ago. And then to teach the progress. And again, the progress is slow and uncertain, but it's important to understand 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, what they represented, but that they weren't followed. That after the Northern troops pulled out in the end of Reconstruction, which was a political compromise after the very contested election of 1876, Southern states and many Northern states and Western states, in terms of how they treated Mexican Americans who were not immigrants. They were conquered people. That was northern Mexico, which
Right.
the United States then conquered,
Yes.
and Asian immigrants, that the 13th, 14th Amendment were not realized, that even the spirit of them were not realized. But even if you were to look at the spirit, I explained in my class that the same Congress that proposed the 14th Amendment, when they were in charge of Washington, D.C. schools, which Washington, D.C. had no home rule then, they segregated those schools. So even the spirit of the 14th Amendment involved racial segregation and mistreatment. And then people learn about Plessy versus Ferguson, which wasn't about education, but it created the separate but equal doctrine. And then learn about Brown versus Board of Education, which was a long planned, difficult campaign, legal campaign involving the use of social science evidence, the Kenneth and Mamie Clark study. And that I point out to my class, there's gender discrimination. Kenneth Clark gets all the credit, even though Mamie actually had as much to do with the famous doll study. And where critical race theory can come in. So for example, when I was in undergrad, I learned about Brown versus Board of Education. It's a landmark case. It's very important. Maybe it wasn't implemented quickly. But then when I was in graduate school, I read Derek Bell and his critiques of Brown versus Board of Education, which gave me a whole new perspective that it really wasn't good. It was a way to excuse the white corporations, kind of let white businesses off the hook to continue perpetuating discrimination under the guise that we're now free. And I think those lessons can be brought down to a K-12 level without the kind of the thick theoretical and analysis of the evidence that you would see in Derek Bell's work. And then currently, I think it's important, and this is where, although critical race theory, all critical theories tend to reject quantitative analysis, and I'm a quantitative person myself, but I do think where it's important to look at quantitatively, and this can be traced statistically, how segregate or discriminatory financial lending practices, which are not that old, that it's even, I was born in 1967, this occurred in my lifetime, have led to, after the end of busing, have led to resegregation of schools. It's not the same resegregation because it's not forced, but it's still the product of discrimination. And so as we can see statistically, more and more schools are getting at the K-12 level are getting resegregated. We can trace that not to as it's being excused as these are just housing patterns where people are choosing to live. It's a result of discriminatory practices. And I think without the advanced nature of critical theory and critical race theory in particular, those lessons need to be taught at the K-12 level. And it's not, I think when the governor and these opponents say it's hating your classmates and hating America, that the hating your classmates, it's not about, the whole point of it is that it's not about people, it's about the system. So it's,
right.
in fact,
Right. That's an important
they're making the argument for critical race theory by making these kinds of claims. And to say it's about hating America, I would say understanding what the realities of this country are is not hating it, it's to improve it. We're never going to get better if we don't understand what's going on. And I've done some work with some indigenous areas where all of the low rated outcomes on health and education in indigenous among indigenous population has been attributed to their failures when it's clearly not. And if we can understand
right,
why, then we can fix that. And
right.
What they're trying to say is we want to pretend it's not there. And if you're going to claim it's there, you just hate us. And to me, it's a very childish attitude at best, but at worst, I think it's extremely reactionary
Mhm.
and is going to set us back
Right.
as a country.
Right. I believe Dr. Jefferson, do you have a comment?
Yes, ma'am. So we've been talking about the premise of critical race theory and how it began in the legal profession. And we've also been talking about how it is told in American history, how the story is told, the perspectives. But I just wanted to point out that Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings was one of the first scholars to apply it to education. And so with regards to the achievement gap, critical race theory, and as educators, we all know that what we do in the classroom is based on theory, such as the constructivist theory. And so what we do in the classroom is based on theory, is based on research, and we as practitioners, because that's what we are in the classroom, and we began to apply those theories. With regards to critical race theory, one of the arguments that Dr. Billings has made is that is basically being able to include race in how we determine how the achievement gap how the achievement gap stems from racism or race. And so there's just so much information out there that tries to address the achievement gap, such as poverty or family dynamics or lack of resources. And so with critical race theory, the argument with regards to education is also including race as an indicator of something that we should be looking at to also explore the achievement gap and how we can close that gap. So I just wanted to point out that, you know, critical race theory it's been cross-discipline so far.
Yes.
And with regards to us in K through 12, this is how it's defined for us. So as I know it's defined differently in all the other disciplines, but within the classroom, K through 12, it is defined for us as a way for us to be able to investigate and to be able to resolve those problems, those academic problems that lead to the achievement gap, and as well as disproportionate suspensions of our children as well. So I just wanted to point out
that's an important point. That's an important point. And in fact, so Gloria Ladson Billings and William Tate wrote that seminal article on toward a critical race theory in education in 1995. And even the term achievement gap has been challenged a lot as being deficit, as if Black children who are always at the bottom, right? That somehow they or their parents or family did something for their achievement to be lower than other racial and ethnic groups. The opportunity gap, however, on the other hand, speaks to this idea of there are opportunities that students of color, particularly Black students, did not have, intentionally did not have access to, which has led to this gap, and don't have access to even today, right? And that leads to that gap. And even talking about the disparities in suspensions and expulsions that are predominantly Black students across the country, not just in Florida, but across the country. It's a national problem, a national trend. That means if you're being suspended as a Black child on a regular basis, even as young as preschool, then by the time you get to elementary, middle, and high school, you're far behind your peers because you weren't in class when they were. They weren't learning. They didn't have that opportunity. So those gaps that exist are not necessarily because of something they did, but because of particular opportunities that have been withheld. And critical race theory analyzes those particular inequities that exist. So let's get to this because there's been questions about trying to understand Florida's law versus Florida's policy. So this is the law as it is written as in terms of required instructional content. And so This was how it was written prior to the policy interpreting what all of this means. So the history of the United States, including the period of discovery, early colonies, War of Independence, so on and so forth. This is what is to be taught, including the civil rights movement to the present. American history shall be viewed as factual, not as constructed, shall be viewed as knowable, teachable, and testable, and shall be defined as the creation of a new nation based largely on the universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. So this is a piece of legislation that was passed by the legislators at the time, around sometime in the 90s, around 1994. If you go still within this section, that's when you will find additional language with regards to specific content to be taught, including the Holocaust and K-12 African-American history curriculum that is supposed to go across content, in which, if that is taught, if a district takes that on, can be deemed an exemplary district. But I don't think there has been too many that have been deemed an exemplary district at this point with teaching that K-12 African-American history. Now, this is the Florida statute. Yes.
I'm sorry, Dr. Dana Thompson-Dorsey. If I could just interject there, because I serve on the state of Florida's task force on African-American history, and you're absolutely right. It's all we can do to come up with strategies to get teachers, K-12, to teach African-American history. Another troubling concern that I have is the chilling effect that this ban will have on the teaching of African-American history. Already, it's not being taught to the extent that this law intended, and that we would have more distinctive districts that were doing that. And so the chilling effect would be that perhaps funding would be withheld, you know, if districts are having conversations about race. And what that will do for teachers, that even teachers with the best of intent to teach African-American history will be chilled into thinking that they will be punished, penalized, or there will be consequences. So that's another concern of this whole.
Absolutely.
Dana, can I ask, can I raise a question?
Yes.
Dana, I'd like to talk about this, but then offer a transition to the question is, what difference does this make to a professor or a teacher K-12 in how they address and teach their class? And what are the implications for it? In a very important presentation, Jennifer Schneider, who I know is in the audience as well, raised the question of who are we in the College of Education when we've been taught to teach values and we've been taught to teach to the truth. And we are surrounded by agendas that are political, that deny us the right to do what we've been taught to do. And what we believe our commonality are the rights of professors in higher education, let alone good teachers of history, solid teachers of history, who are now saying how many scrutinous things are going to happen to me in order to prevent me from teaching the truth as society sees it and I see it, but persons of society don't. And I just like to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, we definitely will. We definitely will get to that.
Okay.
But I want to talk about the Florida policy that, well, it has Florida statute at the top of it because it is an interpretation of the statute we just showed. Yeah. But this is a policy, meaning it did not go before the legislatures for a vote.
Correct.
We don't know why it didn't. I mean, it could be because perhaps there were political members who didn't think it would pass, it would possibly pass, or it would take a long time to pass. And this is something that Governor DeSantis and Commissioner Corcoran wanted in place at the beginning of this academic year. But we don't know why. But it is the board, the Florida Department of Education, that has implemented this policy. And where you see words underlined and highlighted and bolded or additions to the law we just looked at in terms of interpreting what what is required instruction. So what was added in terms of required, so as mentioned in the law, must be factual and objective, and may not, and this is added, may not suppress or distort significant historical events. So that's something new. And then such as Holocaust, slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the contributions of women, African-American and Hispanic people to our country is already provided in that section. Now, this is also what has been added, and is the key point of why we are having this discussion. Examples of theories that distort historical events and are inconsistent with state board approved standards include the denial or minimization of the Holocaust and the teaching of critical race theory, meaning the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. That this also prohibits the use of materials from the 1619 Project to be taught, and it says may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm eager to hear from the panelists of how you all interpret these additions, these policies, this policy, which now are additions to the law on instruction, and what it's saying can be taught, can't be taught, and what teachers or educators should know in K-12 institutions about what they can and cannot do.
We've already discussed and established that CRT is not curriculum. It is
Right.
not something that is taught in K through 12. What this policy is basically saying to me as an educator is that I am told that I need to stay away from supplemental materials such as or mainly the 1619 Project. And so, and I am to teach history from the 17th, from the Declaration of Independence that defined America as this new nation, as well as the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I know we're going to probably talk a little bit more about that, but even in the Declaration of Independence, as everyone knows, says that we are all created equal. We have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we know that there were laws that were put in place even after the Declaration of Independence, such as the Dred Scott decision, that basically said that because he was a Negro, he did not have a right to sue in court. He could not even be a citizen. So obviously the Declaration of Independence did not apply to Dred Scott. It did not apply to Plessy with Plessy versus Ferguson. And so we have documented evidence that there are contradictions to the Declaration of Independence that is not something for us to make kids or anybody feel bad about, but it is just the truth. And it's gonna come up. If you're teaching civics, if we've already taught these kids about John Locke and how he influenced the writers of the Declaration of Independence with natural rights, it's gonna come up. And so that contradiction is there anyway. And so the policy or the statute here also says that we may not suppress it. So if it comes up in conversation, then, students, because we can't suppress it, it has to be able to be discussed. And so there's no way for us to really avoid that contradiction, even from the United States becoming this brand new nation and with the writing of the Declaration of Independence.
I think you're muted, Dana.
Thank you, you're right. Thank you for that. Let me ask you this question then. Is Dred Scott also taught in school, in history?
That's
along
right.
with the Declaration,
Absolutely.
along with the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely. If they're teaching civics, and that is a tested course, U.S. civics in the 7th and the 8th grade, Dred Scott is taught.
And so that is extremely important because, as you mentioned, Justice Taney in that case, said specifically that Africans and their descendants
Cannot be citizens.
that they were brought here as property.
Correct.
And they were never to be included in the Declaration of Independence or to have rights under the Constitution. And then along with that, you have what the 3/5 compromise is part of the Constitution, and where Blacks who are property and considered an inferior race, with no personal rights and privileges under the Constitution, could be deemed 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes.
Correct.
But that's it, only for taxation purposes, 3/5 of a person. So what I would then question in looking at this policy for teachers who are teaching history and who are looking at the Declaration of Independence, and let's make note too what it says in here: creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles, not solely. So even there's some admittance here that the universal principles as stated in the Declaration of Independence were not always universal to everyone, because it would say solely, right? Nation-based solely, but it doesn't. It says largely, which could still be in question, but it says largely. But how does a teacher, which as April was saying, and it also says this as part of this policy, I didn't add this, that teachers are to facilitate discussions for students. Facilitate discussions. When students raise the question, this sounds racist, or why would a Supreme Court justice say such a thing? Right. And if we jump forward even to Plessy v. Ferguson, which I believe students have to read as well, that says similar language, that an inferior race of being Black, even though Plessy was 1/8, had 1/8 Black blood, but that drop of, and was not discernibly Black to anyone. Everyone thought he was white just looking at him, but someone knew he had that 1/8 Black blood, and that was enough to make him Black. How do teachers then answer questions when students want to know, was this racist behavior?
But then it also goes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Jefferson.
You go ahead.
It also goes on the opposite end of that, is when the child asks questions that try to probe into why this was happening or why happened, any of this happened at all, then it can become uncomfortable for some teachers, to where now the child is becoming a discipline issue, to where you're questioning my authority, you're questioning my, teaching, so whatever it may be. And then that can lead into other areas of concerns for not only the child, but then the children that is visibly seeing this happening. They take on different perspectives about, well, who's right in this situation, and are my feelings being disregarded because of the fact that the teacher is taking that particular, presence on what they feel about it or their ideology. So it can become very challenging, overall for the child as well. And especially in my experience for the African-American child.
I would definitely say, and I know educators are aware of this, that we would not bring in our own biases or opinions, where we will stay neutral and just allow the discussion to happen. But even when we go back to Dred Scott decision, as we continue to teach it, bringing out even what the dissenter said, Justice John Marshall, he argued that the Constitution was colorblind and that the United States had no class system. So he supported it. He said that the 14th Amendment basically covers Dred Scott as well. So he was a dissenter. So bringing out that particular perspective already, opens up the door to having that conversation about multiple perspectives on the issue. And I think that what I have, and I know many educators have practiced over time, is having those conversations with our students that where everybody is safe in here and we're going to respect others' opinions. This is what we do to teach good citizenship.
That's right.
This is how we teach them how to move about in a democratic society. So that itself is a lesson. How teaching them how to communicate and to accept others' opinions.
And I think a good lesson too, you know, I mentioned in the other legislation in the 6 states mentioned making children feel bad about themselves. But I think having these discussions is an opportunity to say to students, hey, this is not, we're not talking about your parents or grandparents or you as an individual. When we're talking about these issues, these larger issues of racism, we're talking about something much bigger, much older than any of anything that you or your parents, your grandparents can imagine in terms of any type of system or anything like that. But you as students, with learning about history, with questioning anything happening today, gives you the opportunity to make changes that you think aren't right, or to ask questions about things that aren't right. You are the future of changes that can occur more positively in history that hopefully won't be repeated as in the past.
Dana, can I make a commentary before you go much farther and we go to opening it to the group? I just want to go back to the point I tried to make about teaching differently, what happens. You know, you talked about Plessy versus Ferguson and an awful decision, but you didn't mention the minority decision by Justice Harlan. And you take a look about exploring cases like that. Justice Harlan's belief in dissent becomes the majority in Brown versus Board of Education. So when we teach cases in law, when we talk about Brown versus Board, as Steve has already iterated, it was not the most popular thing in the world.
Right.
I mean, if you remember, President Eisenhower said the worst thing he's ever done was appointing Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the United States, who led and in fact wrote Brown versus Board of Education. So there is an onus on all of us to look at the pluses and minuses of where history leads us.
Right.
And Justice Harlan, you read his minority opinion and you just attach it to Brown and you say, that's what he said in 1896. What's wrong with us? Why did it take so long? And that's the issue. The other thing is professors, teachers. One last comment, and you want to move off of it, that's great. There's a key point what we need to talk about. What do we think teachers and professors have to do differently given this issue when they approach their students in another 3 or 4 weeks? What changes? What do you have to look at? And somewhere along the line, I hope we have at least the beginning of that discussion among us and hopefully involvement of our participants as well. Sorry, I'm done.
Say something real quick about the Dred Scott and as an example and this policy. So, you know, you could say, and it's true, that Dred Scott's a terrible decision. You could say Roger Taney was a despicable, racist, slave owning, and he was. But under this policy, what you seemingly can't say, but which is also true, is that what he was writing in that opinion is how our legal system was established, that the legal system did not consider Blacks to be citizens. And that seems to violate the policy, even though that's really what the lesson of that case is. Not that Roger Taney was the project of prejudice, or another example is the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia decision, which, you know, you could read what John Marshall wrote in that opinion, and you could say, oh, well, you know, that was what people thought back then, but that's not what people thought. That's how our legal system regarded indigenous tribes. And what's so concerning about this policy is that they lump in that kind of teaching of what our system was like with Holocaust denial that is so beyond offensive that there's an agenda here, and it's an agenda that, if it's not stopped, will set this state and this country back generations. That's what my big fear is, that if a K-12 teacher says that the legal system didn't consider Blacks to be citizens of any, whether they were free or not, then and they're going to get in violation of the policy. That's really scary.
That because that is actually distorting historical events. If we expect teachers to say that that's not what Dred Scott was saying, then that would be distorting historical events, and I also want to say this highlighted part here where it says instruction may not utilize material from the 1619 project. That's the project itself. The New York Times, Nicole Hannah Jones 1619 project and materials from the project, that's fine. But teachers should still know they can teach about 1619, right? They can teach about that. And so I think what is really important is understanding facts. What are facts? What are truths? And that you basically, teachers can do what they've been doing, particularly if they are facilitating discussions among students. If students are starting to make connections between some of these materials and even present day issues. We have a 15th Amendment that talks about people having the right to vote, but yet we're still talking about people having the right to vote.
Right.
We're still talking about states, limiting access to people's voting with voter ID laws, and whether you can take water or food to the polls, or if people can give people water or food as they're standing in line for hours and hours, shutting down people can vote, or so that they have to go far away or have transportation to get to other locations that are mainly in wealthy white areas, but not in poor or low income, predominantly Black and brown communities. And so the fact that we're still having these discussions, if students are raising these questions as you're going over their Constitution and talking about the 15th Amendment, or even the 13th Amendment with the loophole, involuntary servitude is unconstitutional, except if you're in prison.
Correct.
Which we know is disproportionately Black and brown people. So students are making these connections. Do you all think teachers have a responsibility not to give their opinion, but to allow that discussion to move forward?
I think so, Dr. Thompson. I'm gonna tell you why. This school to prison pipeline, achievement, so-called achievement gap, it begins as early as preschool. Our children already are aware of differences of how people are treated. We need to allow these kids to have authentic and honest conversations about what they're learning in school and how it relates to everything else that's around them, so that we can help them to avoid internalized trauma that some of them come into our schools with. Anger, low self-esteem, feeling insecure or not good enough. And that goes back to the sociological, what was it, the doll test from Brown versus Board of Education 1, when they talked about how Black kids suffer from inequities, that they, you got a little girl, they're already looking at a white doll. And I know it wasn't, you just got a little girl looking at a white doll and just basically thinking that is the best pick for her. Right. And so I argue the fact that when children feel these insecurities, it does impact them academically. And so we need to make sure or give them an opportunity to be able to express themselves, so that they can see that a lot of the problems that they are dealing with are not entirely their fault. It's not entirely their family's fault. It's not entirely their community's fault. It could, some of the blame does lie in society, with society. And so them being able to examine all those things, everything that's around them as it relates to what they're learning in class, I think it's going to be healthy for them. It doesn't matter what child it is, all children will be able to feel some type of security in who they are. Even our Caucasian students, because they are conflicted as well with everything that they see going on with them, and they need to have an opportunity to express it.
So we have a few questions too from people who are in attendance. One is, what rights do students have to classroom free speech? Is the statute only limiting teacher speech?
Well,
Anybody?
Tinker versus Des Moines gives them the right to free speech. They pretty
Mhm.
much can say what they want to say, as
Mhm.
long as they don't
Cause
um,
disruption.
cause a disruption. So they, the conversations are open for them.
Right.
Yeah,
Dr. Walker, were you gonna say something?
yes, exactly. Yes, I was going to chime in. I'm so sorry. My audio keeps going in and out, but I think I caught the last part of that. And you're absolutely right. Students have freedom of expression. Court cases have defined what that looks like. Everything from, nonverbal freedom of expression with t-shirts and that. But where schools counter that is the disruption. And so what I think we could see is more of schools saying, yes, you have the right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but as you're having these conversations about race, that run counter to the district, that could cause a disruption. I think we have to beware that would be school's defense if they were challenged. That would be what I would imagine that they would try to come back with, both with teachers as well as students.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, because none of us, and I'm going to say none of us, I mean, that's a huge assumption, but I feel confident saying it. None of us were taught true history, American history, in our K to 12. So if you went to a K to 12 public school, none of us were taught true American history. And I think even today with history teachers who are making sure they stick to a particular curriculum are limited to how much truth they can really teach.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if and so I just saw in the chat someone brought up the point that the majority of teachers are white women, and that's true. The majority of our teaching force are white people, close to 90%, but about over 80% of them are white women, white middle class women who don't live in the neighborhoods necessarily, or don't have the same experiences necessarily as Black and brown children that they may educate. And also because none of us, including the majority of white women teachers, were not taught the truth about history. Well, now look at this policy. It's like, we can't talk about race at all. We can't talk about racism at all. Where the truth of the matter is that distortion of history. If we want to continue to lie and say, for example, Christopher Columbus discovered America when there were Native Americans already here, who then were, who were killed by Christopher Columbus and Spaniards who were coming into this country and all of that, who killed Native Americans, enslaved Native Americans. But because we are so determined to make it seem as though the United States has no flaws and never had any flaws, that we're not willing to teach the truth and allow our students, our children, to ask questions and think about how did that happen, the changes that have come since then, and additional changes that need to be made. Is that doing a disservice to our students by not allowing that?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I heard the Kenneth and Mamie Clark Dow studies mentioned earlier. And yeah, and what swayed the Brown case was the self-esteem that those studies symbolize. Well, there have been recreations of the Dow studies and very similar results, so if you go back to the Mamie and Kenneth Clark studies, they'd hold up the white Dow who looked just like the black Dow, same features, only different complexion. And little black girl after little black girl would say she's ugly, she's stinky, she's dirty. And that spoke to the poor self-esteem and ethnic identity. So here's my other fear about this ban in Florida is that we won't have African-American history, because from African-American history, what will stem from that, and I know it did it for me, but I was taught it, by my own mom prior to me even starting school. But what gave me a sense of pride was knowing about the Paul Laurence Dunbars of the world, was, knowing about my African-American ancestors and African ancestors. So I really fear that we're going to lose self-esteem builders, ethnic identity among African-American children and youth in particular.
Unfortunately, I think that's the unstated goal of the people who put the policy out. They think that, if oppressed groups rise, begin to their rights, and they think that that's a problem for them. And I think that's why they put it. And they're using the guise of critical race theory, which is, I think we've all clearly said, is never taught in K-12, to put a chilling effect and scare teachers from talking about race and talking about the truth of American history. And the other issue, the 1619 Project, which is also up there, is what they hold up as the reactionary forces hold up there. And saying you can't teach, most of the 1619 Project materials are historical records. Saying you can't use those materials, saying you can't use historical records to teach history. And that does, people either, people don't like to see things that are bad about themselves or their history. And it's, again, as I said, it's the only way the country is going to get better. But I think it really is an undercurrent of reactionary forces that want to go back to pre-1964.
Right. Yes. And Rachel, can you bring up, I think it's the slide that has the 1619 and 1776 projects side by side, because I think this is very important given with Dr. Tauber, what Stephen just said. So we have the 1619 project here, to our left, the 1776 project, which was part of the commission that Trump put together. And I just want you all to look at this. So as Stephen was saying, Nicole Hannah-Jones put together the 1619 project. It's part of the 40th anniversary of when the first slaves came to what is now to become known as the United States of America, Jamestown, Virginia. And that is made up of historical records, historical documents. 1776 project wants to just talk about America, the patriot education, this nationalist type of curriculum that was being introduced to be taught in schools around the country. Now, we don't have a national curriculum, but this is being proposed, right? And as we know, states and local districts create the curriculum, right? But this is what's been proposed. And that this is also an opportunity to abolish critical race theory. Now, I want to make clear too, that one of the key tenets of critical race theory is to talk about context and history, not to be ahistorical. Because when we are ahistorical, things like this can happen and no one will think much of it, right? But when we talk about history, when we talk about things that occurred in the past, Steve, could you tell us a little bit, Steve Tauber, can you tell us a little bit about what happens in authoritarian type of countries?
In terms of, well, there are, basically usually charismatic leaders that will, completely distort their past, glorify their past as a way to not have people question their authority.
Mhm.
And, there are things that are important to teach about the Declaration of Independence. There's no question about it, but to somehow, as this 1776 project, to distort it as patriotic, which that term has now come to essentially, as I see it, be associated with the Capitol insurrectionists, that you are basically glorifying American history or glorifying, and it's not just in the United States, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Brazil. It could happen in France in the next couple of years, glorifying this past to make people not question their current circumstances. And it leads
Or their
it's-
rights, or their
rights,
speech, or their
right,
free
or-
speech rights, for
right.
example.
and it's not just that it can lead to authoritarianism, it is a tool of authoritarianism.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
what Bolsonaro's doing, that's what Orban's doing, that's what, again, I don't like to be blatantly political, but I think even, one could be politically conservative and not be an authoritarian, but there's no question that Trump undercurrent is an authoritarian undercurrent, that this is what it represents, this idea that our past was perfect, completely whitewashed of any of the terrible things that have happened, even, recently, so that people don't question their rights or question the inequities that still exist, and adhere to the authority. And it's ironically being used in terms of freedom and love of country, when in fact it's the opposite of those things.
Mhm.
To love
Thank
your
you.
country means you love it for its, despite its faults, but you recognize that those faults exist. To say those faults don't exist is not true love of country.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And Rachel, do you mind going back to the policy, the Florida policy? And that, I know we only have a few minutes left, and there was a question. Well, first of all, I'm going to ask this one question, and then I want to see if other people have some additional questions or comments, because I saw a lot of wonderful conversation occurring in the chat. But there was another question: what is a 2 to 3 sentence answer I can give parents about critical race theory if I'm accused of breaking the policy, not the statute, the policy, because of discussion in my classroom?
Mm.
Does anybody want to take that?
For me, I believe that you won't find a lot of parents questioning it, to be honest. I think it's just kind of taken out of proportion, so to speak.
I think April, did she freeze? Yeah. Okay, we're going to wait till she comes back. Does someone else have a comment?
Let me try.
Okay.
It is an historical view of the concept of racism in society that is provided by evidence through our history and our documents. It's
Mhm.
not personal opinion, it's what was done that we can say, this is evidence to succeed in that explanation, period. You want to give a quick answer, not necessarily fulfilling, but a quick answer, that's what it is.
Right. Right. And I will also note that, and I think Stephen Tauber brought this up about the putting the denial and minimization of the Holocaust in this policy, which is offensive. But there's also a part of the law, the statute itself, that talks about the Holocaust being taught, and it has to be taught from a perspective of discussing racism and understanding racism. Now, one would question, well, why can you make sure, why do you specifically say in teaching the Holocaust, students have to have an understanding of racism, but not when we talk about American society? And I think about the fact that where did the Holocaust occur?
Not in America.
Exactly. Exactly. So
I
there's
think
not a stain on America when you talk about the Holocaust.
except
So it's okay to talk about racism with that. Go ahead, Sharon. Sorry.
except for when America refused to allow Jewish people who were trying to flee Germany
Mhm,
entrance into the company, into our country to save their lives.
mhm.
But I think that policy basically, once again tries to minimize the experience of Africans and African Americans in this country with regards to racism.
Mhm.
And so to have the emphasis on the Holocaust, which did not occur in the United States for over 200 years, as African slavery did, is offensive.
Yeah. Steve, Pramooze, you've been asked to repeat the statement that you made in terms of how you would define critical race theory if parents were to ask about it, or accuse teachers of teaching.
You're asking me to recreate history right here. The basic premise was it's a study of the documents that support it's documents that support a study of those documents and elements involved in law, like statutes and laws per se, that relate to any sense of systemic concerns about race. I mean, I would just say it that way. It's not all the truth, it's good enough. And by the way, good enough is there. Can I also add one point before we all leave?
Sure.
You want the good news or the bad news?
You can give us both.
Well, the good news essentially is that I've not heard anybody about litigating. We have a lot of law where the Supreme Court of the United States has overruled state dicta on, not having languages taught after the wars,
Right.
that vaccination can in fact be a demand of the state on its citizens, a lot of this. The question is litigating and its value in contrast to what is, what does not happen. I again say to you, this is also framed in censorship. We have to be very careful of looking away from this. And there have been times in which the Supreme Court of the United States has overruled states. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, look at the constituency of the Supreme Court of the United States now, and the very careful modeling led by our Kentucky colleague in framing the presence of who sits on that committee now. And will that difference make a change in how courts will normally look at this issue? And my comment to all teachers is, don't be afraid of being yourself. Look at the rules of the state, look at the rules of your district, look at the rules of your school, and do not be so afraid. If everybody is afraid, we lose.
That's right.
So that's based on, I don't know, my own history.
And you need to have really teachers hopefully have supportive building and district leaders who understand the importance of teaching history and facts. And
they have to follow the rules too, but they have to follow the rules too. So work with people, not against them in deciding what to do. Right,
exactly. Are there any questions that we did not answer that people want to ask now before we leave each other? Or any questions that I missed?
Dana, I just think you need to be commended for doing this. Gathering this group of intellectual scholars, with my exception, who talk candidly and realistically about the importance of what is and what is not critical race theory, but in the construct of racism that is systematic
Mhm,
and systemic.
mhm.
And I think you have done great justice in offering this out of the Anchin Center, which was why the Anchin Center was really developed years ago. So I thank you and everybody who's been part of this, and also thank you to my very kind and good colleagues for being on this panel with me.
Yes. And I want to thank you all as well. I want to thank everyone who took time out of their evening to attend and to participate in this discussion on chat, such lively discussion. Thank you all. I'm going to ask one more time before we leave each other. Are there any questions or comments that anyone has? Because we don't want any teachers, any educators going back into their school fearful, as Dr. Pramooze mentioned, or unsure of what they can or cannot do because of this policy that's in place regarding critical race theory.
Can I just say also, thank you to Dana and Rachel and the
Okay.
other.
Can you mute people? I'm sorry. People
Am I
can't
muted?
unmute. No, I was talking to Rachel, and people will have some questions, but they can't unmute.
And also, I want to thank all the teachers out there, because you really have a thankless job, you know, and
Yeah.
college professors, we can say what we want in the class, and we have very, you know, I've been an administrator and a regular professor, and we have very little pressure on us, and our jobs are important. But as an educator, I know from my own experience that my K through 12 teachers were really pivotal in my life. So thank you to all you teachers out there.
Yes, thank you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Thompson, there was someone who had made a comment or had a question in the chat that I wanted to read because I thought
Okay.
that was pretty important. She said, a teacher shared with me her description of CRT the other day that I found insightful. She compared it to how we address topics in AP history courses. We look at topics through the lens of economy, religion, etc. Would that be a correct analogy or a way to look at it?
So they're saying they're looking there in AP. Well, first of all, I think in AP as well, they have access to pretty much any documents out there they want to use and read, right?
Right.
But is this teacher also saying that they can look through different
lenses? Yes, that's
okay.
right.
So yes, that's a good analogy. That critical race theory is a particular lens that, as in that original definition, forefronts race and racism and power, though. You know, it's looking at it through that particular lens, and it's a historical lens, because when we have questions, you know, similar like when in these AP classes, I'm sure when people have particular questions of why the economy looks, you know, the way it does, or our banking system looks the way it does, or why are we so dependent on laws for everything. And you have these certain lenses of looking at that'll take us back in time at a historical context. Critical race theory does just that. But it forefronts the issues of race and racism.
Thank you.
Dana, this is Cheryl Joe.
Hi. Yes.
Hi. As a district leader in, I'll say Imperial Polk County, this was informative to me because I'm that voice in the wilderness.
Yes.
Wow.
Trying to get people to understand this is a dog whistle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just commend all of you, Steve, Pramooze, all of you. I gotta follow you because you're so insightful, and Dr. Jefferson, all of you. But I have to go and stand in front of teachers and leaders every day. I need to be informed, and so this refreshed me. So thank you.
Thank you. And I had an opportunity, Cheryl, to meet your new superintendent at the NAACP Lakeland branch CRT forum last week. And I think you have a lot of support there from what I can tell. And but we all need more, right?
I left the board. I left the board meeting, and I don't know if we're past time. with
Okay.
lines out the door
Wow.
of people
Wow. Wow.
protesting his
Mm.
his informational work with the NAACP around critical race.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I know that they called for his people, there were legislators, state representatives calling for his resignation or his
Yes.
termination for
So thank you.
participating in that forum. But he is an ally, and from what I understand, there are board members who support him as well, and not because he supports critical race theory, because as he admits to, it's never been taught in K-12 schools, and he's not very familiar with it himself. But he does support students and teachers having the right to speech, having the right to teach truth and facts, and also he believes in equity and justice and inclusion in classrooms, and that would include teaching African American history, because it's American history.
Okay, history, yes.
So so that's a good place to start. And hopefully we'll all have opportunities to have more of these discussions. But I will say to all of you that remain, if you are unsure or continue to have questions or run into circumstances as you get back into the classroom, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will do the best I can to be able to help you work through that. I've worked with school teachers and school leaders and being able to address some of these issues on how do we teach about issues of race and racism, and factually, and not with us giving our opinion, but just allowing students to make connections and then allowing them to build on that discussion. And so how do we create lesson plans that allow that and include materials that are going to help really bring in that truth and fact? Because we have textbooks now that don't really talk about slavery or the founding of this country in true fashion.
True.
So
And
any
how
other?
race,
Yes,
yeah.
go ahead, Sharon.
And how race actually began. We tell the story about Prince Henry the Navigator, just how the narrative began, and whoever controls the narrative controls the people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Let me check the chat just to make sure. My contact info. So let me put my email on here. I have to go back to. Okay. I'm going to just put my email in the chat. And want to thank everyone for attending and for sticking around, even though we're past 8 o'clock. And we'll be having a lot more professional development. We have a conference coming up in October that I hope you all will attend as well. There's a lot of opportunity for us to learn together and to deal with some of these societal struggles that we're dealing with, but how to be able to address them through classes that we teach and conversations that we're having in schools and in communities. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take good care.
Bye.
I hope the school year gets off to a great start. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.